Sup, Coordi-Nation? How's it going? On the pod today, we have Primavera De Filippi, who is a research fellow at Harvard University's Berkman Center for Internet Society and a research director at the National Center of Scientific Research in Paris. Prima is a longtime researcher on blockchain tech, director of the European-funded project Blockchaingov, and a co-host of the Blockchain Socialist podcast series entitled Overthrowing the Network State. So basically, Blockchaingov is a European-based transdisciplinary research effort aimed at promoting better on-chain and off-chain distributed governance practices and looks at how blockchain can be used to support community, institutional, and global governance. Prima is also an artist using artistic practices to illustrate her research in creating blockchain-based art. I wanted to have her on the podcast to talk about this idea that she has for Communations or Coordi-Nations as network state alternatives. So if you've been listening to the pod for the last 100 episodes, you know that I like to call the audience Coordi-Nation. It's a little shit post after Ryan and David call their audience Bankless Nation. But, what would it take to build a Coordi-Nation? And how does that differ from a network state? If you're interested in the idea of giving people options and giving people voice, as opposed to just the ability for them to exit their nation states into network states, then this episode is for you. Prima is just a galaxy brain. I appreciate that she thinks deeply about blockchain-based governance, but it's not just theory. She is also building these things, and as an artist is actually building things that play with these ideas and plays with these concepts in the real world. And I just think that a priori knowledge in theory, and empirical knowledge, which is knowledge derived through experience, are just a really powerful way for exploring new design spaces. And Prima, for me, it exemplifies that. She's one of the most requested podcast guests that I've had for the GreenPilled podcast. And so I'm really excited to present to you today, Primavera De Filippi. Enjoy, Coordi-Nation.
Working in Web3 is awesome, but working outside of the typical W-2 employee structure is a deal breaker for so many. Opolis is helping the self-sovereign worker focus on what they do best: their work. Tax time is coming up. Opolis helps professionalize your business by helping you form an entity, generate proof of employment through pay stubs, and receive a W-2 at the end of the tax year. Are you self-employed and forced to spend money on expensive healthcare insurance with limited coverage? Opolis leverages group buying power through a community employment co-op, helping you save 20 to 50% on high-quality, affordable healthcare options through Cigna. And finally, Opolis's member owners share in Opolis's success and profits based on their work token holdings. You must be authorized to work inside the United States in select Canadian provinces to receive Opolis's benefits. Book a 30-minute free consultation with Opolis's experts and join Opolis by March 31st, 2023 to get 1,000 work and 1,000 bank tokens. Go to connect.opolis.co/bankless to get started. And if you're going to ETH Denver, make sure to stop by the Opolis booth or attend their Future of Work Summit hosted by Opolis. The Glow dollar is a new stablecoin with a very special property. As the market cap of Glow goes up, extreme poverty goes down. Glow is a dollar-backed, non-profit stablecoin that creates basic income for people living in extreme poverty. Glow is basically the same business model as USDC, with yield-generating treasuries on one side and a stablecoin on Ethereum on the other. But instead of being a for-profit company, Glow is a non-profit that donates 100% of all yields from the Glow Reserve to Give Directly's basic income program. Give Directly is a charity that gives people money, no strings attached, to people living in poverty, and is a charity that Vitalik has previously donated to and supported in the past. With Glow, you can reduce poverty just by holding a stablecoin. Glow is launching in early 2023, and you can join the waitlist at glowdollar.org/greenpill. That's glodollar.org/greenpill.
Hey, Primavera, how's it going?
Hi, very good. How about you?
Pretty good. I know that we've been circling each other for a long time, so really excited to chat. So can you tell me, maybe a good place to start would be this new series that you have on the Blockchain Socialist podcast series called Overthrowing the Network State. What's that all about?
So this is an interesting series in the sense that there is a little group of people that somehow like self-identified each other. A little group of people that are actually highly disappointed by the book, The Network State from Balaji. But the interesting thing is that the reason that we are so disappointed about this book is because we all had very high expectations about the book, because the idea of a network state is actually something that does resonate a lot And then reading the book, all of a sudden, a lot of the hopes and expectations that we had are slowly dismantled over every pages. And yet, the concept of a network state is interesting, and I think there is some resonance that the book nonetheless has managed to create, and there is some quite a large amount of people that do resonate with the underlying principle, the notion, the concept, the name of the network state, which might not at all have anything to do with the way in which it is described into the book. And so the idea with the podcast is actually to try and provide an alternative narrative, an alternative conceptualization of what, and whether it's called a network state or not a network state, that's another question. But that particular concept that people are resonating around, and we want to make sure that these initial coalition of interest, this resonance that the book has created, does not get dissipated just because when people read the book they realize that's not really what they were hoping for, and kind of like piggybacking on the initial instigation of the book in order to actually create an alternative concept that the people that were reading the book and got disappointed by the book actually can coalesce around.
Do you have a name for the alternative that you want to build? Have you settled on an alternative meme to network state?
Yeah, so that's actually the big challenge, because the network state is an amazing meme. It's an amazing name. Yeah. We've been playing around with the notion of Coordi-Nation or Communation in terms of community and nation. But yeah, the idea is to create an alternative meme that doesn't focus on the concept of statehood, but rather focus on the concept of nationhood. And that is just as appealing and attractive as the network state, but that reflects better what we are really talking about, which doesn't have much to do with a state, but more with a new way of coordinating nations.
Yeah. Well, it's just a fun little meme for me because I've been calling the audience of the GreenPilled podcast Coordi-Nation for about a year now. And that was it started off as a shit post because Ryan and David, GreenPill goes out on the Bankless Network, and Ryan and David they call their audience the Bankless Nation. And so I thought it would be fun to call the GreenPill audience the Coordi-Nation, but it's kind of stuck. I think it's a good meme. So I'll throw that in as the hat in the ring, and maybe we could build the meme together. But I'm actually curious, if you have any reactions to that as a meme, but also, what's the difference between like statehood and nationhood? Because I heard you kind of pick apart and focus more on, I think, nationhood over statehood.
Yeah, so the state is a very institutional, bureaucratical entity, which essentially gather, like, is the way in which a particular nation choose to coordinate itself through a particular territorially based institution that creates a particular government and govern that population on a particular territory. Whereas the nation is more like, so I'm not going to use the words institutional and institutional, but it's like it's the more cultural and interpersonal thing, in which there is a group of people that do identify themselves as sharing a particular cultural background or cultural values and principles, and there is this sense of collective identity that comes with it, right? And so today, when we talk about nation states, oftentimes those two things are intermingled with one another, even though, in fact, states do not necessarily match with nations. And we have seen this, for instance, with like Yugoslavia, or like, where you have one state that actually encompasses multiple nations, and this might also create some issues at some point. Vice versa, you have nations that can like span across jurisdictions and across territories, which nonetheless recognize themselves as a particular nation. So the two are very different, even though historically there is a strong connection, because usually a state is the way in which a nation chooses to coordinate itself. But in practice, the two are very different. One is very institutionally constructed as a governance structure, and the other is more of a identity, cultural, recognition that people belong to a particular nation, and there is this self-identification as part of this nation.
Got it. So I think that's an important distinction. Well, I guess I'd like to really move into why we want to overflow the network state. So I'm on the networkstate.com. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Overthrow.
Yeah. So Balaji in the networkstate.com has the network state in one sentence, in one image, in one essay, and in one book. And the one sentence definition is a highly aligned online community with a capacity for collective action that crowdfunds territory around the world and eventually gains diplomatic recognition from pre-existing states. So do you have pushback on that definition, or is it when you start to get into a more high fidelity version of Balaji's vision that you start to really have a problem with the network state concept or movement or vision?
Yeah, so to me, my first red flag is actually when there is the claim of crowdfunding territory in order to acquire diplomatic recognition. Because when you talk about acquiring diplomatic recognition, and actually when you talk about network state, and you're talking about a state, in some way it's kind of interesting because the whole narrative is about states are not apt to manage the new modern or technologically enhanced or enabled community that are emerging nowadays. But at the same time, the network state is actually exiting from the state in order to create a new state. And so you're actually there is little innovation in that sense. You're actually just you're not happy with the way in which existing nation states are operating, and therefore let's create a new state. But actually you're creating the same thing, except that you're exiting from the previous one to create a new one, which to me sounds a little bit funny, right? It's like we do actually have new opportunities. We have new technology that enable new possible ways of coordination. And if there is indeed those nations, and I think the place in which we both resonate is that with Balaji is that the internet and digital technology have enabled the emergence of new nations that are not geographically bound. And these like full acknowledgement, absolutely agree on that point. Now, the problem that I see in Balaji's book is that the reaction to the fact that there are new nations that are emerging, which are digitally bound or digitally native, is to recreate a state, to reuse the same governance systems that we have created before the internet, which is the statehood. And instead of actually exploring, are there new mechanisms that do not even look at all like a state, but that enable those new digital nations, and not only digital, because in the end, a nation is both digital and physical, but that enable those new nations to coordinate themselves in a novel way that doesn't have to replicate the same institutional background that the state has had. And to me, this is where I had very high expectation about the network state because I thought it was an innovation on the notion of statehood. And instead, reading the book, it just happens to be like just yet another state that just create like it's a distributed state in the terms of like its network territories, but the actual infrastructure is pretty close to what we have today in terms of statehood.
Right, and all of the things that sort of come along with that.
Exactly.
So I'd be curious if we're building a Coordi-Nation or a Communation, I think is the other meme that you used. What is your vision for that? I wonder if you could unfurl that a little bit for us.
Yeah, so to me, one thing that really bothers me about this exit-based type of solution that Balaji provides is that the state is actually, I mean, we might dislike some states, but if we think about it, that's a huge institution that is doing a lot of stuff. If you exit one state, you pretty much have to recreate a lot of what the state is doing, and good luck doing that, on your own, like from scratch. And so this kind of exit-based governance means that in order to actually enjoy the benefits of this new network state type of things,
Mhm.
you actually have to exit the existing states and create your own little sovereign territory that declares independence and therefore is no longer supported by the existing states, which means that in some way, like, it's kind of like either or, right? You kind of like, you lose no matter what, because you don't want to, you
Mhm.
want to benefit from the network state because the network state might have like some really cool advanced rules and like stuff that I want. But at the same time, the only way I get that is exiting from my current state, which actually might have a lot of things that I also like. And so in some way, I need to choose between this or that, but I cannot have both. So the alternative memes of Coordi-Nation, Communation, or however we're gonna figure out a name to call it, is actually not based on this exit-based type of governance, but rather it's based on adding choices, right? And it's like, how do we actually create more capacity for people to plug themselves into a variety of Communations and Coordi-Nations, which do not require to exit from your existing nation states, because you still want to benefit. Like, there is a lot of benefits that you get from actually being in a particular state, but there is a lot of things that you don't get. And there is a lot of things that you think perhaps that today with digital communities and digital technology, we might do better. And so let's experiment with that and let's try to actually set up those new mechanisms, those additional layers of governance that are not competing with existing states, but are actually cooperating with them by providing additional services, and people can choose to join. And it's not about joining one and then you're just stuck in that particular one. You can choose. You can choose between like 10 different ones, and like in some way, like the same thing that, like, blockchain, DeFi, like this composability structure in which you have like a lot of small entities that are providing a small service, but then they can be interconnected, but you can choose the way in which you interconnect them. And so all of a sudden you have like a variety of additional choices and the choice about how you want to interconnect them. And kind of like in some way, like the underlying narrative is that if those combinations and those coordination actually do their job correctly, then we can actually start understanding that there is some kind of distinction to be made between the state. And the state is doing, like, the state is the landlord. The state is doing some
Mhm.
very important task of managing
Mhm.
the land, managing the infrastructure of the land, and all that is like intrinsically territorially bound. You probably don't want to deal with that. Like, the state is already doing that, and they're doing a good or bad job, doesn't matter. But like, the combination can help the state, can contribute to the state in order to help managing these like public or common infrastructure, while also providing those additional layers in which things that are not at all territorially bound, and that the landlord doesn't have to deal with them, right? And today the thing is that the state is actually covering a very, very large, a very thick stack of stuff, because there is no alternative. The only alternative is the market, right? And the idea is today to explore this new intermediary that is not a pure privatized market-based mechanism, but that is also not a pure public system that is governed by the state, but actually identifying that there are communities that are interested in providing or managing collective resources and engaging into some kind of collective actions, not in a market driven perspective and not in a public state funded perspective either, but rather with this kind of like commons based approach. And all of a sudden
Mhm.
there is now three actors, three typology of management and coordination that are interdependent to each other. There is the public infrastructure, which probably we want to leave to the state because that's a hard job to deal with. We have the market that is dealing with everything that wants to be private, and then you have the combination, coordination, whatever you want to call it, which is dealing with all the stuff in which existing nations or digital nation, new type of nations, recognize that there is something that they want to do together, recognize that there are resources that they want to pool together, and recognize also that they want to have a particular coordination mechanism in order to manage those resources and in order to act collectively, right? And today there is this very sharp distinction between public sector and private sector. And the idea with the Coordi-Nation is to inject a new typology of actors or entities, which is like, the civic sector or like the commons sector, which is not fully private, but is also not fully public, and it's more commons based.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say that I'm getting flashbacks from listening to your Overthrowing the Network State podcast that you've been running on you've been co-hosting on the Blockchain Socialist podcast. And so that there's going to be a link to that in the show notes. Would encourage our listeners to check out that podcast series. I recall listening to that podcast and thinking that there was some sort of trilemma between exit and voice and participation. And the criticism of the network state was that it was too exit focused. That might not be the trilemma though. Was it exit and voice, and there was like a third axis that you could design for? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, exactly. So there's the usual dilemma. Well, the usual dichotomy is like exit or voice. And basically the network state focus essentially on exit, which is like, if you're not happy with the way things go, don't worry. You can just crowdfund your own territory and create a new state where everyone agrees with you. Great. So exit-based mechanism. But what is the price of exit? The price of exit is actual exit, meaning that everything that you had in the current model, you lose it because now you're exiting that system. So exit-based system is an interesting, very interesting type of governance, which has become very popular. Like the whole concept of like exit and voice is mostly like for digital, because when you have something digital, exit is costless. I mean, there's always the cost of like losing the community and the network effect, but it's easier to exit because you can literally cut and paste, right? If I'm not happy with a particular software development, I can take it and fork it, and all of a sudden I have exactly the same code base and I can try something else, but I'm not losing all the infrastructure because the infrastructure is digital. The problem of exit when you get into the physical space is that exiting actually means exiting. Like you actually leave a place to go to another place, and then everything that was in that place, you don't have access to it anymore. So the cost of exit becomes very high. The alternative is voice, where voice will be like, let's speak, let's do demonstration, manifestation, let's actually try to change things from the inside, from the outside, and so forth, which is basically like, we recognize that the system is there, we don't want to leave the system, but we want to change it, and so we are expressing our voice in order to change it. The third one that we discussed during the podcast was options, right? Which is like, there is always this problem, which is like, what does even a costless type of exit mean? Is that you're not locked into a system. If you don't have options, you can exit to everywhere you are. You can exit at any time, but where do you go? Do you actually have the option to go to the place that you really want to go? And if all the options are not pleasant, then do you really have sovereignty over which system you want to go, or you're just going to go to the least worst one, right? And so options is interesting, but in terms of exit, meaning that the value of an exit-based governance depends on the value of the options that are available to you. But most importantly, and I think this is where the Communation Coordi-Nations comes about, is like, why do you even have to exit? Can you not just increase the number of choices without requiring the exit, and just having all this kind of this plethora of different systems that you can plug yourself into? And the fact that I join one system doesn't mean that I need to exit another system, to the extent that those systems recognize that there is some degree of interdependence, and therefore there is a need for coordination between those interdependencies, right? And in some way it's important, because if you want full autonomy and full independence, this is very costly, because full independence means that you need to start from scratch. You depend on no one, but therefore you depend only on yourself. You have to build the whole stuff on your own, and that takes a lot of work. Whereas interdependence comes at the cost of interdependence. You're not fully autonomous. You are constraining a little bit your freedom, but the capacity becomes much larger because all of a sudden, one, you reduce the need for redundancy, because if everyone is independent, everyone needs to recreate everything on their own. And so we have like, that's very inefficient. There is like so many redundancy because everyone wants to recreate their own thing from scratch. And so from like an efficiency perspective, interdependence is actually better because we can all plug into a particular system, with of course the caveat that then we need to figure out a way to govern this shared common resource, right? And this is where the challenge comes about. And to me, in like the network state description of Balaji, this whole question of governance is kind of like dismissed as if we don't need governance anymore because we can just create our own systems. But what is the cost of that? And do we really want to recreate everything from scratch? And do we really want to create such an extreme degree of redundancy just because we don't want to figure out a way to coordinate ourselves, right? And the whole interesting part with the common-based approach is that if we find people that are aligned and that share a particular societal vision, you still need coordination. You will never escape from the problem of governance. Even the most extreme network state, as long as there is more than one person, there will still be governance problems, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Well, would it be fair? This might be too reductionist, but this is the way I'm conceiving it in my mind. It seems like we understand that digital governance is going to be important. Like moving from the FANG companies where we're all just serfs on Mark Zuckerberg's land and Bezos' land, and we have no rights, to a place where there is digital governance and communities are moving more and more online is going to be a thing. And then from there, it's a question of, well, what do those communities look like and how do they relate to the communities that we're already in? And if there's a trilemma between options and voice and exit, it feels like Balaji is in network state is very heavy on distrusting the old institutions and on exit, whereas the Coordi-Nation is a little bit more spread across the options and exit and voice. Is that too reductionist? Is there anything you would push back on there in that conception?
It's I think it's a good reduction. It's a bit reduction, but it's a very good reduction in that sense.
Well, one thing that I think is important is, and I think the network state does really well, is that, you know, you look at the table of contents and it starts off with network state in one sentence, in one image, in one essay, and then in one book. And so whatever your fidelity or the amount of attention that you have, it kind of has captured the meme at the 280 characters level or the 280 pages level. And I think it's pretty important. I don't know if anyone in the audience listens to my Twitter, but I'm somewhat of a aspiring memeticist myself. And so figuring out a way to meme Coordi-Nations or Communations in the same way that the network state has memed, I think is part of the marketing for this idea. So just trying to find a simple way to explain Coordi-Nations and how they differ from network states.
Yeah, so maybe I can try and suggest. So we went through the exercise of trying to define Coordi-Nations or Communations in one small paragraph, a few sentences, which kind of try to map, like compare and contrast between the network state definition. So maybe I can try and propose this definition. The idea is like, similarly to the network state, Coordi-Nation or Communation is a voluntary community of individuals which have a shared culture, because that's the focus of nation, which share also some principles and values, and most importantly, they all have either an explicit or an implicit agenda for achieving a shared societal vision. Right. And I think this is like not so different from the network state. Maybe a little difference will be that while the network state is actually based on like those basic fundamental principle which do not necessarily relate to a shared societal vision, right? It's like when Balaji talks about like the keto network state. Sure, so a diet is an important element of one's lifestyle, but that doesn't really talk of the societal vision of what would, because you can have many different society which are all keto, and some of them are in a very different political direction than the other. So it's kind of difficult to just look at this one fundamental principle that inform the network state and then assume that everyone that has that does the same principle will actually share the same societal vision. So we try to be a little bit more I guess granular or accurate in the definition of what is it that creates this communality between people. And it's not just that we think keto is great, but it is about the fact that we share this vision of society, right? The second component is that a communation, and this is also similar to the network state, operates both at the global and at the local level. It's not just a digital community. It's also recognizing the fact that those people that belong to the digital community also exist in the physical world and have their own communities in the physical world. So a communation operates both at the global and at the local level. And they have this objective of bringing people together into collective action in order to further that vision, that societal vision that they have in common. And they have this also desire of collective governance and collective management and use of commons resources, which is something that we added to the definition of the network state, because the network state doesn't really talk about commons, doesn't talk about common infrastructure, common resources, which is actually a fundamental element. Like any type of nation that wants to coordinate itself eventually have some common resources to deal with. And then the third element, which is where there is a big bifurcation between the network state and the Communations, is that the Communation is not competing with existing states. So because they are not a state, so if you have like two things that are the same things, they are necessarily competing with each other. If you have like apples and orange, there is no competition. I mean, they are both fruits, but they are not competing with each other on that level. And so the idea with the Communation is not to create an alternative state that will require you to choose between one or the other, but rather to cooperate and to actually exist alongside the current nation states. And adding, so instead of like the network state is kind of like, here is one state, and then we are buying territory in the states, in various states, and then we are declaring sovereignty, and we create this distributed territory for a new state. With the Communation, the idea is not at all to claim sovereignty over any territory, it's to add layers of sovereignty that are transnational, that transcend the notion of territory, while recognizing the fact that people exist in those territories. And so by adding those new layers of sovereignty, you declare sovereignty on those particular domains that are not geographically bound. And that's the main difference, because the network state is actually claiming territory and therefore claiming sovereignty over territorially based issues. Whereas the Communation just leaves all that is territorially based to the state, because that's what states are for, deal with the territory, and create those new layers of stuff, of like sovereignty, of like collective management, collective action, and so forth, for everything that is not necessarily bound to the territory. And so if we take the analogy again of the landlord and the tenant, the landlord doesn't have to say about what I do in the house as long as I don't ruin the infrastructure. This is something that is to be dealt with within the community that lives into the infrastructure, right? And so the Communation are more those kind of like transnational entities of people that share particular values and societal vision, but that are taking care of everything but the territorial stuff. And because of that, they don't need to declare sovereignty. And in fact, they are not in a competitive aspect with existing states, but quite to the opposite. They are actually coming as collaborators because they are providing new services that perhaps the state is not providing, or perhaps is not providing good enough, and that communities are eager to provide to themselves.
Yeah. I'm wondering, as I'm just kind of swimming in some of these ideas and listening to you, if are there any projects out there that you think are building a combination or a coordination that kind of fits your vision? Is there anyone that's doing it well right now? And if not, what can we do to engineer, stimulate more people building these?
Yes. So I don't think there is any tangible example of combination, just like I think there is currently no tangible example of network state.
Mm,
But the network state has inspired people to experiment with that. The combination is easier in some way because obtaining diplomatic recognition is very hard. Combination is more
mm,
about, we do have already a lot of digital communities that operate and to some extent have like some shared resources, but those resources are oftentimes digital. And so I would say like a lot of the open source projects, there 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 are some very small prototype of a combination in the sense that you have people that are working together, they engage in collective action, they have their own governance apart on that particular digital resources. The challenge is how do you bring this back into the physical? And I think
mm,
this is where there is a distinction between just a digital community, which we already have lots of, and an actual combination, which is not just digital but also interface with the physical world and with physical community and local communities. Um, I will say, like, out of many, and that might be a controversial statement, but I'm very interested to explore this, is actually like religions, right?
mm.
If you think about religions, like, I don't know, like the Christianity, so you have the Vatican, which is, we are not really, this is a state, but it's like, it is both a network state and a combination, I think. So it's a very interesting and mental exercise. But you have those entities in which, like, there is a group of people that identify themselves with particular values that have a strong form of allegiance to those values. Uh,
Mhm.
and there is some kind of principle, and like anywhere you go in the world, you have like those embassies, which are churches, which are not, they are not declaring independence. It's not like you don't need to have like an actual embassy of the Vatican in every country. You just need to have a space, and in this case, those are like spaces of prayer. But you have a space in which people know that they can come and meet, and it's okay, right? Like there is no claim of sovereignty over the territory, but you're providing a service, which in this case is a religious service. I think religions have been kind of doing those things uh, for many years because it's not a state. Sometimes they are associated with the state, sometimes they are not associated with the state. But you do clearly have these forms of very strong allegiance, very strong cultural identity, despite independent of the actual territory, and yet having instances of those. Of those nations, if we want to call it like religious nations, that
Mm.
actually emerge a little bit everywhere in the world. So I'm not saying this is the best example to follow, but this is clearly an interesting case study to explore
Yeah.
in order to understand, well, what would a non-religious alternative look like? And is there any such thing already? I think there's also something interesting to distinguish between movements. So there is, like, we do have digital and global movements around the world. I think a movement is not yet a combination because it's too broad, right? There is like shared values, but there is not this recognition of a shared collective identity, right?
Mhm.
And again, I don't know if religion passed that threshold, because sometimes you can have different tribes, different nations that are part of the same movement but do not actually recognize themselves as a whole. And I think the
Yeah.
naming and the recognition of this entity as a particular cultural entity that people can recognize themselves as being part of and provide allegiance to is an important component. And again, I think that the territory, the ground is very fertile for that. And my personal interest in actually bringing about this alternative meme is because I think that if only the concept actually gets spread around, maybe a lot of things that today are not acting and are not recognizing themselves as a communation might actually become one. Because I think there is a lot of communities that are close to turning into a communation, but the lack of the concept, the lack of the vocabulary, and therefore the lack of the conceptualization of these as a communation, then reduce them to a digital community, to a movement, or to just like, a tribe, without really exercising more effort into actually becoming a communation.
It's actually a really good segue into my next question, which is, what does the world look like in which you're maximally successful? Say you meme Coordi-Nations into the universe and they start to pop up, I don't know, let's say 10 years from now, 2033. What does the world in which this movement is maximally successful look like?
Yeah, I think it's, to me, it's a place in which I don't know if in English you have the same expression. In French, we call it the third sector, which is like literally the civic sector, which is a place in which people recognize that it is possible to coordinate and to manage these things together without having to rely on the public infrastructure of the state, and also without having to rely on a market infrastructure. And there is obviously a lot of small, often local communities that are actually engaging in those things, but we haven't reached the level in which those communities grasp at the global level. There is this very beautiful concept that Michel Bauwens have been working on for many years now, that is called cosmolocalism, which is pretty much like, so it's about local but cosmopolitan, but not in terms of like globalization, where there is one thing that takes over the whole domain, but rather federation of local entities that share those particular values and actually manage to have a global impact because they are connecting with each other. And to me, in a success story will be that because of this meme, instead of trying to create enclaves of I will put it very bluntly in terms of like enclaves of libertarianism, where you have people that want to escape from the state for good, bad reasons, doesn't matter, but really like enclave, like excluding oneself out of the state. What I think success will be is rather that we do have more interconnection, and having all those local communities and digital communities that identify that they have something in common in terms of the societal values, and then find ways through digital technologies or not, but find ways to coordinate themselves better so that they provide a valuable and sustainable alternative to the existing public infrastructure and to the existing private infrastructure. And for me, like if we manage it, I don't want the civic sector to take over, right? I don't think there should be only that. But I think that today there is a strong dominance between public and private, and there is not enough energy and attention given to this third sector, that is the civic sector, that is the commons-based sector. And I think if only we could recognize that many things are actually possible if we have the right coordination mechanism and if we have the right governance structure for this coordination and for this management of collective resources, then a lot of things could be done in a more fine-tuned manner. And the composability that comes with that, I think, will lead to very interesting outcomes that are very difficult to imagine right now, because right now we are the public infrastructure is very monolithic into a particular territory. The market infrastructure is global, but it's very market-based and individualistic. And I'm very curious and I'm very eager to push towards that direction in order to see like what would a composable civic sector oriented towards common-based infrastructure and collective management would look like.
Yeah. It's quite interesting. I'm curious to hear the feedback to this episode, hear what kind of what kind of ideas and movements this stimulates, and if there's any way that people can help you build this meme and build this movement. So my next question is actually not about Coordi-Nations at all. I want to ask you about your side project, but is there anything I didn't ask about Coordi-Nations that you want to say?
Yeah, maybe just like one small thing, because I think it's important, especially for the blockchain, the blockchain community.
Mm,
I think there is something interesting that I think the internet has enabled the whole incredible new domain of digital communities
yeah.
and global interconnection and so forth, which is exceptional. I want to add why I think that the Communation is relevant to the blockchain, and why is the blockchain relevant to the Communation, which is about, because we don't want to exit, right? We don't want to exit, and yet the Communation wants to have some stronger feeling of self-determination and actual sovereignty. And the interesting thing about the blockchain is that, because you add those new layers of sovereignty with an infrastructure that is actually transcending the national boundaries, but is transcending the national boundaries a little bit more than the internet, because nowadays, unfortunately, the internet is actually very geographically bound by those large online operators that are pretty much controlling the majority of the traffic on the internet. And so with a blockchain infrastructure, you can actually create systems and coordination system and governance systems that do not belong to any given state, and also that cannot be affected by them, while of course the state still has jurisdiction over the people using those systems, right? So it's not about escaping regulation. It's not about like running away from the state sovereignty, but it's about creating systems that actually have their own sovereignty. And their own sovereignty is based on the governance that the Communation will figure out for the systems. And so whether it's about creating currencies, whether it's about creating credentials, attestations, digital passport, whatever you want to do, those are interesting components that can really become self-sovereign while coexisting with existing sovereignties of jurisdictional based states, right? And to me, this is where the blockchain actually really brings something new that was not as easy to do before, because before it was difficult to create additional layer of sovereignty without those new layer of sovereignty also being bound to existing territorial sovereignties. And the blockchain actually opened this new window towards actually creating transnational and territorial layers of sovereignty. And I think the Communation, as we are trying to design them, can benefit immensely from like, if they really want to be self-determinated and self-sovereign, they need to also have a technological infrastructure that is equally self-determinated and self-sovereign.
I think that this is a really good segue into my last question, which is just a fun question. And I wanted to show off to the audience that you're not just into meta governance and blockchain governance, but you're actually a blockchain hacker yourself. So with that preamble, I'm wondering if you can tell us about Plantoid, which it says in my notes is a blockchain-based life form.
Yes. So maybe I can bring it close to
So for those of us who are watching on video, we're seeing Prima showing us her living room, which has a lot of real plants, but there's actually a digital blockchain-based life form plant that's glowing for the audio listeners, and the video listeners will be able to see it.
The Plantoid is actually, it's one of my early attempts of using artistic practice as a way of actually illustrating my research, and because I pretty much dedicated all my research to blockchain and DAOs and new governance structures, then the Plantoid is actually a physical representation of how you can interact with something that is actually incarnating the DAO in the physical world. So I can describe it here. So here you can see this little creature. It's mostly made of chains. So it's a blockchain plant. And essentially, you can, the whole point of a plantoid is to reproduce itself. So like any other life form, it's trying to figure out how to collect resources in order to ensure its own reproduction. And so a plantoid, just like many plants, is not capable of reproducing itself on its own, and it requires pollinators. So traditional plants, they need like bees or butterflies, and plantoids, they need humans, and they rely on the capitalization process. So what you can do with those plantoids is you can feed them with crypto. And when you feed them, I can try to make a little demo, but I don't have the speaker, but I can try with the headphones. So when you feed them, they start playing music. And let's try to see if... I don't know if you can hear.
Yeah, we can hear a kind of a pulsating cyber plant sound. So for those of us who are listening on audio, what Prima is doing is pointing her camera at the plantoid, which is kind of this growing blockchain plant form. And we're going to send a transaction on Goerli that's going to cause the plant to play some music and light up. Is that right?
Yeah, and what's happening is that when you send the money, you can then interact with the plant with those little sensors, and so you can modulate the music. And then the more you pay, the longer is the period in which you can play the music. And then at the end of the period, the music that you have created is minted as an NFT and is sent back to the address that actually has sent the money. And then this NFT becomes the seed of the plantoid. And and so whenever the seed is being disseminated by the people, there is like the royalty. So 10% is sent back to the plantoid. And so the plantoid is accumulating capital. The more seeds are created and the more seeds are sold, up to the point in which the plantoid has accumulated enough capital to reproduce itself. And then it's like the standard DAO model. So there is a open call for proposals. People can submit propositions about how they want to create the next version of the plantoid. And then all the people that own a seed of the plantoid, all the people that have purchased the NFT, they can vote on the proposition that they like the most. And then the plantoid automatically will hire the proposed winner, the one that submitted the submission that got selected, and that person will be hired to create a new physical plantoid that will become part of the descendancy of the plantoid species.
Right. One of the things that I just think is so cool is like when people have all these theories and try to create a movement by like thought leadering, it's one thing. It's like a priori knowledge, theoretical knowledge, but then you get a certain amount of value from just experimenting and tinkering and empirical knowledge. And what I like about you, Prima, is that you're just coming at it from both ends as a hacker, but also as someone who's involved in theorizing about governance, and that's how you learn and you move forward. So Plantoid as itself is an interesting experiment, but I'm interested in, as you're building Coordi-Nations over the next 10 years, what kind of interesting IoT type of infrastructure you're gonna build for them, and what kind of experiments are gonna come out too.
Yeah, I think I'm a frustrated academic because I love academia and I love research, but at the same time, sometimes there are things that are just too, there are opportunities that are too amazing, and it's very difficult to just stay stuck into the academic realm. And so somehow, art is a very good way of actually expressing those concepts in a way that is more accessible, but also like, just trying to get things done and trying to move in the direction in which I believe those opportunities can actually have an impact. I think it's very important.
Yeah. Well, what a great place to end. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to show off with Plantoid before we wrap?
I think we're good.
Okay. Well, Prima, I'm really excited about what you're doing. I think that you're creating an interesting discussion about networks. We haven't even gotten into all the other great stuff that you've done in the ecosystem, but thank you for coming on GreenPill. You're an inspiration to me, and I know many others in the space. So looking forward to seeing how everything grows over the next several years.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Prima. Peace.